Hello and welcome to another Daily Muppet. In today's video, I'm going to talk about some rather unpopular subjects for sure, but I'm going to discuss specifically Marcus Rashford's situation, clarify a few things there in alignment with Ruben Amorim's comments, and an interesting counter sort of brief by INEOS and United. I'm also going to talk about INEOS and some of the current discourse surrounding them and the whole subject. Talk about as well Ruben Amorim's comments on rotation, the academy, and how it will be dealt with moving forward, as well as the coming January window. So let's get right into it. So first and foremost, obviously, with Marcus Rashford has not been in the team for a few games. Obviously, Ruben continues to just get a lot of questions about him and things like that. The reality of this, is interesting because, he was dropped from the team first alongside Garnacho. Then it was put out to a few journalists, and I've said before, maybe by not exactly a brief by the club, but by some people that have been encouraged to push Rashford out the door, that he was for sale. Now, this was not denied by anybody. This was not turned down. This was not countered or anything, but that they were looking to sell him. Now, immediately, obviously, following this, he gave his interview, and as Henry Winter put it in that interview, he asked him the questions about the headlines about being for sale and all of that. Whether this was correct or misguided or not, whatever, not to discuss that at this point. But then interestingly, the other day, there was, I think yesterday, there was articles being put out that pretty much briefed, because you could see the line going to everybody, the same thing, that INEOS or Jim, etc., were not pushing Amorim to sell Marcus Rashford. That it is entirely up to his call what happens with him in the future and where it goes with Rashford moving forward. And so there's a couple important things to note here. Number one, it was a pointlessness to brief to it was definitely incorrect or wrong in terms of whether it was a good thing to do to put out that Rashford was for sale in mid-December. It's also the wrong thing for Rashford probably to do to put out wanting to leave in mid-December in response to that. Neither of those things was wanted by the club or by Amorim or would have been desired by him and shouldn't have gone out there. The situation has always been, as I said, that every player is on and in a position where they have to prove themselves to Ruben Amorim and the others over the course of this season, or they will be sold, or they will be put up for sale in the summer, and they will be in danger of not remaining at United. That has been the case for every single player. Discussions were held with Rashford and those in the hierarchy in the summer. As I've said this before, this is not new. And the decision was that ideally he'd get back to his best and not be sold. And so, he did not pursue, and this was agreed upon by both sides. He did not pursue or open the door to any inquiries that would have come in to tell him to, sure, we're interested in this, talk with the club, etc. So there was really nothing around him leaving in summer, even though prior to that he thought he would be potentially leaving. So it's an interesting kind of situation. The important part of this overall is that it's down to Amorim. If Amorim wants Marcus Rashford to get going and Rashford puts the effort in and he plays him and he does well, that's what, it's what Amorim would want. That's who it's being left to, on this to make that evaluation. And that goes for every single player. Once again, that the manager is going to evaluate the players in his squad, who's performing and who's not. That's the main job he has in evaluating his squad. And then he'll let them know, okay, yeah, look, he can go, etc. So it is up to Amorim. I think that's very important. It's important that it's continued to be stated and pushed that the manager is not being forced to pick or not pick players on the basis of, finance or on the basis of management overall. That's not really the point. But it is also important to note that they are willing to move on everybody and understanding and cognizant of the costs of each player, and that they will have to prove themselves to a point where they're useful. But that is for everybody. And I think that's important when we get into the next section as well. So yeah, I think it was interesting that that story went out yesterday, that Amorim wasn't under pressure to sell him, and that essentially the whole decision was being left to him, which he said a few times, because that's the part where it should be. And I think it was a somewhat counteracting the whole story, because the best case scenario is that the situation quiets down, Amorim sorts it out with Rashford and he plays, and then in summer he goes or stays. That's fine. But the mess that it is at the moment, where it got, between the he's for sale, he wants to leave, was not at all the ideal situation. Even if they were going to sell him, which is a distinct possibility, that whole conflict was not the ideal situation to be in right now, for United and where they wanted to be. So I saw that as a little bit of a pushback against that. So we'll see what happens moving forward. We will see what happens moving forward with this. But obviously, it is up to Ruben, and he's doing really everything that he can to figure out the team and get it right and to sort it. Now, I think that is rather interesting, when you look at Ruben Amorim's comments and how they're taken by fans in comparison to some of the recent stories and such around INEOS. I think it's a very interesting dynamic. I said yesterday, which I think is totally true, that obviously there's issues, but I think it's very interesting to see the level of negativity in media and such towards INEOS at this point in time, as they're attempting to fix the club, as compared to what the Glazers have done for 20 years and driving the club into the ground. Ruben Amorim can come out on the football side of things and say, we have to suffer, or we'll be back in the same place in a year. We have to go through some pain, or we'll continue to struggle. We have to do things that we don't want to do, or we will not improve. And we've seen that. And that's my perspective on it too, is that, we have to, as a football club, from a football standpoint, it's easier to see this, that sometimes you have to be worse to be better. Sometimes you have to do things different. You have to, we talk about it with the football side of things, is like you have to stop attacking in transitions in order to learn how to actually control the game and have possession, but then you may struggle to score and you may have worse results in the short term, but it's for a long-term game. Well, when he says that, everybody gets it. I think people understand it. Well, I think most people understand it. It's really no different with INEOS. It's really no different with the ownership of the club. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff about cuts, about all the little cuts, and I can tell you they're not even 1/10 of the cuts that are occurring. But they're also at every single level. It's not just $50 saved on every employee for these little things. It's not just, cutting back the hours of the small employees. It's also at the middle executive level. They've had, I told you, when I looked on LinkedIn, things like that every single day, 5 more people leaving. And these are not all bottom level employees. These are mid-level employees. And some even to the higher level. Ambassador roles being cut, expenses being saved there, players looking at it and saying, yeah, we're going to sell. We're not giving out contracts in the way that we used to a Lindelof now, or just throwing it willy-nilly to Harry Maguire, to, we'll consider it. Even Bruno Fernandes got a 1-year extension on his contract. This approach has actually encompassed every single level of the football club. They sold young players that usually we might have just sat on and seen if they'd done anything, and then they'd waste away. In Alvaro Fernandez, in Willy Cambuala, and individuals like that. There's been a lot more than you think at all levels of savings. And, I understand the way that it can be perceived. there's a whole thing from Swiss Ramble about the financial state on FFP and PSR and how close United came to falling afoul of it at the end of last year, at the end of June 30th. It was 2 million. They were 2 million away. Now, essentially, that all happened was all thing. I talked about this in I think it was in May. I said, look, the problem is they can't do anything about all the player expenses and all the other expenses right now because it's the middle of the season. It's not the summer window. You can't do anything about it. These guys are all under contract. These expenses you can't do anything about. If you look at it, have INEOS given out any contracts yet to players? Have they handed out any of them? I think Bruno Fernandes got the +1 essentially, and that's about it, right? Aside from signing new players who are all on potentially shorter contracts and lower wages than before. So the majority of the spending at the club are things that they can't do anything about, right? I think that in terms of the transfers, they spent far, far better cost-wise than in previous windows. If you look at it, right, De Ligt was like 40 million, Xerxes 35 million, Ugarte 50 million. Who else did they buy? Mazraoui was like 13. You look at the cost for the players that they purchased compared to 80 million, 72 million for Rasmus Højlund, 55 for Casemiro, 60 for Mason Mount, 80 for Antony, the types of expenses that have been there, right? They've done a lot of the expenses on the football side are things that they can't do anything about as of yet. But they have spent a lot better and made sure to not go crazy with spending to put themselves into a hole while still doing transfers, which of course they knew they had to do. Because if they didn't do transfers because, well, financial reasons, then it would be, you'd have the exact same issue. But they were 2 million away from PSR. This is a business that is losing over 100 million a year on average over the last 3 to 5 years. You understand that? It's losing an enormous amount of money. It's completely non-viable, and they were 2 million away from that PSR gap. Well, I can promise you this is a fact. All those little cuts that they made totaled more than that 2 million. So without all of those little cuts, United would have fallen afoul of PSR guidelines and would have ended up in penalty where you can get transfer bans, you can get points deductions, you can get, we've seen it, that clubs have been getting it. And that would be worse. And, it's a really tricky situation, because I look at it and I see some of the discourse around us, people saying, well, they're tearing out the soul of the club. What soul of the club? Hasn't that been done for the last 20 years by the Glazers? Isn't that been the point? Isn't that what everybody's been saying for a long, long time? Which is totally correct, that has been happening. That the Glazers have driven the club into the ground, or we conveniently forget now and act like it was suddenly all good under the Glazers. And people say, when you look at things like, well, they kept the ticket prices down, they had Christmas parties, they had all these things. That's great. Who foot the bill for that? It's you, the fans, by loading the club up with debt. When the club is losing hundreds of millions every few years, they could say, we're keeping ticket prices down. And then on the back end, we're piling debt on the club. Now, how's that debt being paid back? It's not. So now the club is in a financial situation where it has to raise ticket prices. So guess who raised ticket prices? The Glazers, not INEOS. Guess who made all these cuts? The Glazers, not INEOS. Right? That's the reality of it. Because when you keep expenses high, and I've look, my day job, I work with small businesses on the regular, from a basis of oversight, on advertising, on financial management, on things like that. And I see what people do every single day, and it's so normal. You keep your expenses high, and your debt goes up. You're not saving anything. You're not, doing anything by doing that. They keep a bunch of employees on. They don't want to fire people, but the business accumulates debt. Who's paying for that? Where is that coming from? You're really robbing one area to pay for another, and that's what's been going on for the last 20 years. And that's why the club is in the financial situation where it can't afford it anymore. So you can keep ticket prices down, okay? And then the club accumulates so much debt that it becomes financially non-viable, and now you need new areas of income and revenue, so you have to raise ticket prices. So, they're really, you see the point here. You save money as a fan on one side, and debt accumulates on the other side, and then later you're asked to pay that back. That's not INEOS. That's Glazers. You paid for those Christmas parties, for them to keep a ton of employees that were unnecessary from a business standpoint. You're paying for it because the club is in debt. And it's tricky. I've had these discussions with business owners where I've said, look, I've had discussions with a lot of business owners where they've come in and they've been in a situation where their business is non-viable and they're not making any money. They've put a lot of money into it. They've put a lot of risk into it. They've done that. So this is not about greed, and that's an important point to note on this. It's not about greed. They're sitting there. They're actually going to debt every month, having a failing business, all of that they've started. And I say, well, look, you got to let go of employees. You have to fire your employees. You can't afford them. Well, they're like family. I don't want to fire them. Okay. So you either let 2 go now, or they're all losing their job in a year. So what's better for your family, for these people that you care about? Maybe you shouldn't have driven the business into the ground in the first place if you cared about your family. If you cared about these people so much to where you're at a point now where you have to fire them. That's the reality of it. And that's the stance I take on it. INEOS are doing things that are definitely unpopular. And they're going to continue to do things that are definitely unpopular. But I think there are 2 things that are important to keep in mind about it. One is intention. They're not taking this club to make a profit. They do need the club to be profitable, meaning self-sustaining, viable, because that's how PSR works. The club has to be self-sustaining and viable. So Jim has already put $300 million in. That means that he's already gone over the maximum allowable for PSR, understand? Right? He's already gone over the maximum allowable for that over this period of time. So more contributions don't help PSR. We can't just put more money in to do more transfers to help offset it so you can keep building it. You have to make these cuts. You have to make these changes. You have to pay these things off. The club has to be financially viable. The difference is they're not going to take any money out of the club. It doesn't need to be profitable so that some rich people can make money on it, right? That's not why it has to be profitable. It needs to be profitable so that the money can be reinvested back into the club in the form of transfers, in the form of improving facilities. Look, they've already rebuilt Carrington. They've invested and put a lot of money into improving quite a number of things, but it's not perfect. The problem is that, of course, they're going to make mistakes on the football side of it. You cannot get it all right, but you can't stop doing it, right? It didn't work out with Dan Ashworth, so you can't say, well, we need to keep these things, and we need to keep all of these other benefits in place, so we're going to keep Dan Ashworth on and continue to make bad football decisions that don't align, because otherwise we'll have to make cuts elsewhere. That's not an option in terms of where they're at, unfortunately. So yeah, they're not going to get everything right. There's no doubt about that on the football side of things. There's going to be big mistakes. But I think it is important to judge based on intention and what they're trying to do. And also recognize that this is far, far, far from a situation created by INEOS. It's a situation where even with $300 million pumped in already in 1 year, more than anybody's put in ever, right? Because the Glazers put nothing in. That the club remains in dire straits financially. That's how bad it is, right? That's how bad it is. That's shocking, right? And that's the issue. And so, I because I think it's, I don't think that fans should shouldn't raise their voice on certain things, right? And I don't think that fans shouldn't keep there as a balancing act to all of this stuff, right? And continue to make themselves heard on the things that are going on, but at the same time, recognize that, you know, the goal is to get United back up to where it needs to be. And you can't always listen to fans, you know. The biggest financial mistake that INEOS made this summer was doing something that most fans wanted, which was keeping Erik ten Hag. That's true. I'm not saying they did it because of fans, but that's the fact, you know. So there are always going to be things that they do and decisions that they make that are going to upset fans from a football standpoint. And obviously at the same time, you know, you do want to have fans in mind when it comes to, you know, the club itself and how it runs and all that. That's totally understandable. And I'm not even saying like, oh, I agree, the tickets should be that price that high or anything like that. Honestly, I think that they're scrounging and scraping every dollar at the moment that they can in order to get the club in a position where it can still do what it needs to from a football standpoint, from a transfer standpoint, all of that, you know, to get back on top. I don't think it's necessarily something that will continue forever, but we knew there were going to be huge cuts, that they were going to reduce the workforce down ginormously, that they were going to cut a whole bunch of things that they see as excess. And part of it is, I'm telling you from the outside and from the other side of this, without actually looking at the books in the detail that they're looking at them, it is impossible to know whether or not whether these things are necessary or not. It just is. And I do wish there was more. I do wish there was more discourse that was reasonable around this instead of just constant, you know, oh, everybody's unhappy. I mean, come on, man. I things about morale being at its lowest, fine. So what? So are United on the pitch at their lowest because of the Glazers for 20 years, because of the decisions that have been happening for all this time. You know, trying to pin it on the recent things is ridiculous. So morale was high, but we weren't winning anything for 10 years and the club was plunging into debt. There's a point where you say, fuck it. None of that matters. At the end of the day, the job is to get the club winning on the pitch and becoming the best football club in the world. And that will make more people happy as a fan base than anything else. It will. It's what's missing. It's what's wanted, you know? And as long as the club is not being run for the profit of the owner, which it won't, Sir Jim will never take a dollar out of United. And he obviously has set a target of, we are not getting this club into more debt, right? We're not pushing this club further into the hole. That has to end, and the club needs to turn around and stop losing money. That is generally the priority of anyone when they come in and take over a business. And the difference is they're not making it profitable to take money out, but to keep that money in there. And that's important. So, I think it's important to discuss this. You can call me INEOS PR show, whatever. Fuck it. I really don't care. I can look at these things from a fairly objective way, and that's what I'm doing. And that's what I'll continue to do, because it's necessary. A lot of the stuff is necessary. A lot of the stuff, when you add it all together, it's quite reasonable. It's unfortunate, okay? It's unfortunate, but it's a reality and a consequence of what has happened. Too long has the club been pushed deeper into the hole in order to maintain the status quo. And why did the Glazers not raise ticket prices or do any of these things earlier? Only one reason: they were scared of the fans protesting against them. That's it, right? Because they were taking money out of the club and they were pushing. So they pushed the club further into debt in order to not make unpopular decisions because they were scared of fans and fan sentiment. Well, INEOS aren't. And so they're making some unpopular decisions, and also greed, I would add, on the Glazers side of things, because they were still using all of the private jets and things like that for whatever they wanted, and tons of excess money and, all of that. Well, a lot of that has been taken away. But, INEOS are obviously not scared to make the unpopular decisions that they know they need to make so the club doesn't go further into debt. And I think that's just important to know. I do think it is. And I think as a fan base, it's important not to get caught up in it, especially under the guise of people pushing false, myths like, about Sir Sheikh Jassim and things still that were never realistic. That by day 3 there'd be no this or that, but you couldn't prove the funds to the New York Stock Exchange. How funny is that? Okay, it is what it is. An important part of that is the academy. So I shared a couple weeks ago that Sir Jim and INEOS also wanted to be more ruthless on the academy side of things in terms of their look. And it's not just Sir Jim. This is Barada. This is Wilcox. Now remember that that Man City are generally at the top of the academy at the youth levels, along with Chelsea, right? Very, very successful from this perspective, but they also make an enormous amount of money selling players. You look at how much money has come in to Chelsea and City from selling academy players all over the place, through the Premier League, through Europe, all of that. They've got players everywhere, and it has allowed them to essentially fund themselves. And this is a huge area where United could become way more profitable without having to do all of the shit that they've been doing, right? And it's another thing where you get people saying, the academy, United's history, all of that kind of stuff. But I don't think these two things are at ends at all. I don't think these two things are at opposite ends in the slightest. United have this wonderful thing with the academy, where obviously you've had an academy product in there for however long that it's been, and that's okay. When you look at it, I think that people can look and they can see things like Chelsea and City and say, well, we don't want to be like that. But Chelsea have had academy products in their teams for a long time as well, and they've had quite a number of academy graduates. And it's not like you then don't use the academy or anything like that. But what is important is that United have for the longest time sat on players for far too long, right? We've sat on players forever when they're not going to make it, and then they end up leaving for free or for 500 million. You can't tell me that there wasn't a point when Zidane Iqbal was worth more if we'd sold him, but that he got too old, to the point where, they're not worth it. But you also look at something really interesting. When I think it's the under 18s level, we're winning like every single game. Look at how the hype grew over all of the players. Does that mean they're all that good? I don't think so. The majority of them are still not going to make it. But the interest, the hype, the eyes, the view of all of these players improved by the academy being more successful as well, even at the youth levels of winning things. And so there was a story recently that there's been tensions between Wilcox and people in the academy and such about this, that the club needs to be better at the youth levels, needs to win things, needs to be at the leading in the academy leagues and all that. And it can seem rather silly, but when you actually look at it overall and you look at what happens, well, Wilcox ran a very successful City academy that produced loads and loads of talent that end up playing in the Premier League. Loads and loads of talent. He obviously knows how to do it. When you look at how many players, have come out of that City academy that are playing in the Premier League right now, there's a lot of them. And then if you look at as well how much money in terms of profitability that it brought into City, that essentially, aside from all the cheating and stuff, was a big contributory factor in their funding and everything. And it matters. You look at how Chelsea have been able to spend like crazy and now essentially be back into the competition for the top of the league. A lot of that comes down to academy sales. A lot of that comes down to the finances that they made on those players. This is an area United have been, far, far behind for the longest time, right? When you look at the finances of it and the profitability of it. I mean, I think Scott McTominay is probably our most profitable sale ever, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong on that because I was just thinking about it recently, and obviously that's later on, right? But you look at some of the talk about, why would Rashford be a huge sale for United? Well, academy, right? Those are sales that have saved us. When you look at the giant losses that we've made, well, sales of Anthony Elanga, sales of like Dean Henderson in 23-24, a lot of those are the only reasons that United didn't fall afoul of PSR, was being able to sell, kind of academy products. And United need to do that a lot more. It's not to say that you don't want the academy to produce talents to make it into Manchester United. That is not at opposite ends. Could not be further from the difference, because those are free players that you get into the club that you don't have to pay a transfer for. They want that. They want to continue to the pipeline from Carrington, from the academy level to Carrington to Old Trafford. They want that to remain as strong as ever, but they want it to also be an academy that is more ruthless in producing talents that if they need to sell them, they sell them, that they move them on. And so, yeah, that's something that's a big focus. And you saw it this summer, Kambuala, Hannibal, Pellistri, Alvaro Fernandez all leaving, that they focused on, let's all these players who are getting into these higher ages that haven't really made it yet, we got to sell them before it's too late. And we got to get players out on loan earlier, and we got to do all of that. So they want to do all of those things while making the academy also more successful so that it's in the eyes of more clubs. Because, we can argue it however we want, whether winning the leagues matters at the bottom level. But at the bottom, I say at the youth levels. But it seems to, because the clubs that win it, their players sell more. Their players get more interest in them. And so, United need to be back in there. And the whole purpose of this is, again, we want to have the best academy that produces great talents for the club, but also is very, very good at funding the club as well from a profitability standpoint. And again, I would point to, in all of this discussion, my take on this, which is that this is a PSR problem, and that if the way that PSR is set up now, it requires these things in order to remain competitive, especially when it doesn't seem to be enforced, not PSR, but some of the financial things on other clubs. And when you're competing in Europe, a lot of the decisions that have to be made that are unpopular are all about PSR. And all of it really comes down to that at the end of the day, So understandably, it's a difficult problem because you don't want people being able to pump endless money into the clubs, because part of that is what created this, right? This whole current financial economy in football was money being pumped into it, from outside rather than clubs being self-sustaining, which has resulted in a lot of smaller clubs having so much difficulty keeping up as well, and their failures into. But anyway, this is where they want to be in the academy. So, that story that expressed that really confirms what I was saying on this, which is their need to and want to be more ruthless in this area. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. And it's not about reducing the importance of the academy in the slightest, not at all. But it is about it being more so. When we had Chong, when we had Gomez, when we had these players who were being hyped up at that level when they were coming through, Garner, Greenwood, all at the same time, well, one of them was good enough for United. The other ones weren't. But we got nothing, for these players that could have been sold for much more at the time. And it's just a bit of a different take, so it's a little bit tricky, but it's something that is important. Ruben Amorim has continued to state that the rotation reasons that he's doing really come down to preventing injuries. And we've kind of seen that, right? I think over the last few games, we're finally starting to see a little more consistency with a few players that he wants to play regularly that are definitely in his first 11, right? You see that Ahmad is, you see that Ugarte is, you see that Bruno is, though maybe he should be one player you could consider looking at here for a rotation. But regardless, you can see that there's more players that are sticking into his first 11, starting to play back-to-backs, starting to play more minutes on the regular. And so it's starting to settle on that, but then it's which of those players can handle the demands and which ones can't. And he's still, as he indicates it, having to rotate more than he wants to prevent injuries, right? And so, this is obviously a major factor, that the fitness levels at the club, that the levels that were gained are not there enough. Now, there's players who are going to be injured no matter what, right? Unfortunately, Mason Mount, Luke Shaw, you treat them carefully, they still get injured. There's nothing you can do about it. But there's plenty where they're working up those fitness levels regularly, but also making sure that they don't get injured while you're trying to get them back up to that level. And that's where you'll be with like a Rasmus Højlund, with Ahmad, with Ugarte, with Mazraoui, with Yoro, with Delict probably as well, where he's working in the best 11 and making sure soon that they can play most every game, not every game, but most, and you can at least play back-to-back, so you can rotate 1 to 2 players at a time, and that way rotate through most of the team. But yeah, that's the reason why he's doing it for sure. But that's good news, because what it means is that ideally soon now, because we've had this period of heavy rotation, right? So even while we've had some good results and some bad results, a lot of that is simply a consequence of, as well, the relationships not being that established on the pitch between a consistency of players. And so ideally, as he starts to figure out, okay, I've got it now. I know who my most important players are. I know who I want to pick every game. We'll see more and more of them, and they'll start to build more and more relationships, but also in training, they'll start to build more and more relationships, which is what is needed. And then we'll see the consistency come up here, and hopefully the cutting out of errors and players being on the same page, because those are really the things that have cost us, where the system has been, I think, very successful at improving certain aspects of the game. It's miscommunications, it's not being on the same page, it's schoolboy errors that have cost us a lot so far. And some of that is a consequence of them just not playing together in the same settled team that much. And so we should be moving towards that, but understandably, the rotation is an issue. And honestly, a couple small transfers would make a huge difference for this. And that's where I think, in January, United could be active here. I've not been told or heard anything as of yet that would indicate to me that it's off the table of United making a move in January if they, on these same areas that we've been talking about. A left back coming into the club at this point in time would enable, for one, Dalot and Mazraoui to stay on the other side, potentially, right? But it would actually free up a whole lot of things, where, like with one player, you can get players into more settled positions where you're having less chop and change and things like that, and you can keep players where you want them to be. So that would be one thing that could make a significant difference to United, obviously, that on that left back front. And I still, as far as I hear, that's still something that is a priority and of interest, and hopefully, they will make moves on. They have been in touch with a lot of people. They have been evaluating all this, and they have been, looking to settle, on these decisions. So January is coming very soon. And I think that we'll find out pretty shortly whether they're going to be able to make a move on this or not. And I think to some respect, again, it's the financials, is that they're doing everything they can to ensure that they have the finances to do something in this position. Then there's the young players that we've spoken about kind of in these attacking 10 positions. Well, the situation surrounding, obviously, Garnacho, Rashford, different between the two of them, mind you, but situation where they're not performing, where Mason Mount is out, at minimum, one of those younger players becomes maybe potentially more of a need than before, where a Chris Rigg or Nipan or otherwise could become someone that actually is important for the future, but also is more important even now, that they can start getting into the team. Now, that may not be viewed as good enough at this point in time to make signings like that. I understand, but that may be all that's viable. We will see. Obviously, a major departure in January could help. They're still continuing to look at that potential. Is there anywhere for Christian Eriksen to land? Because freeing up those wages would actually open the door to some fairly significant transfers. Same goes for Casemiro. Same would go for Rashford. Same would go for Anthony. Same would go for anybody who's right now on the fringes of making it in the team or not making it. If they can move them on, that would go a long way. And so that's still one of the things that they're looking at. But it is tricky. It is really tricky what's going to happen here. I've spoken a lot about the players that we're looking at. I don't know. I can honestly say I don't know as of today if they've made a move for any one of those. I see a lot of stories about things like Osimhen, but the problems where they feel they're really lacking Like, there's fundamental issues where they can't even put out a proper team before getting into that. And as far as my understanding is, those issues are being looked at way more for the immediate than something like that. So I'm not hearing anything in that respect. But I've maintained that for some time, that the striker thing is something for later. But that right now the urgency is on areas where they feel like they're not even able to put a proper position or a proper player out due to fitness and injuries and the lack of it in the squad. And so I still believe that those will be the main focal areas. But I cannot tell you today whether they've made a move for a left back or not. I don't think that they have. Obviously, it's not January yet, so we will see. But they do have all of these targets in mind for a few different positions. So yeah, let's see. Let's see if I or anybody else obviously get something soon on them making those kinds of decisions. But as far as I've heard from the people I speak with, it's still those main areas being prioritized of the the other areas being prioritized, not striker. And so I'm not really buying into any of those stories as of this point in time for myself. So anyway, long-winded video today, but it's Christmas Eve here, and I'm gonna go after this, go home, have family coming over, then Christmas tomorrow, and then I will be back on Thursday, and we'll probably do our podcast on Thursday before or after the game, and it'll be a special, Boxing Day watch along that I hope you will attend and enjoy. So yeah, thank you for watching this. I hope a lot of it was at least interesting from a perspective. I have a lot of this stuff isn't my opinion. It's all formulated on the basis of conversations that I've had. That I have a good pulse on the intentions of INEOS and what they're doing on things like that. That I have that. And so it's not really my opinions. Obviously I have my objective evaluations of things, and I think that there's mistakes being made and all of that when I discuss all of this. But I understand the intentions, and I understand where things are at, and I think that that's why it's important to just kind of get that across. I think it matters. I do. I understand what they're doing, whether or not I agree with all of it. It's hard to say without being the one looking at everything, without being the one with the full access to the books and the finances and the bank accounts and all of that stuff to the level that they have. It's hard to know without being there whether all these decisions are correct or not, but I do understand what they're dealing with and what the intentions are. And I hope that as a fan, we can pretty much, as fans in general, we can continue to get behind it, because while some of these things are difficult, much like it is on the football pitch, we're going to have to struggle a little to get where we want to be. And it's going to be a bit painful, but I do think that being together as a fan base will help all of these things and to keep pushing in the right direction for the manager, for everybody. Anyway, that's what I have. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas and holiday period. I hope you, I hope you spend good time with your family. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you back in a couple of days. Thank you for watching. Thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for everything, for supporting me, the channel, everything this year. It really does mean the absolute world to me to be able to take part in the discourse with the United fans and United fan base and all of that. And it's given me things that I didn't know I would ever be able to do and have and all of that. So thank you all. Appreciate you. Have a great Christmas, a great holidays, and I'll see you in a couple of days. Thanks for watching.